Well, hello, and welcome to the Pioneers Show, the show where we talk with innovators, makers, entrepreneurs, basically people who are creating their own trails and creating their own lives, so that we all can learn about how to work with our own lives. This is episode 4, and I'm your host, André de Albuquerque. You can find me at It's the Andre on Twitter and on Instagram, as well as the show at Pioneers Show on Instagram as well. Before I go introduce the guest, I would just love to thank Sam, last week's episode, for the introduction. With us today, we have Nathan Williams. Nathan is a very charismatic person. He's a multi-time founder. A Canadian now living in Berlin, he's now working on a solution for supply chain blockchain applied for conflict minerals. Just in case you didn't understand a single thing I just said, might as well jump into the show with this week's guest, Nathan. Hello, Nathan.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. So, for the ones at home that don't know who you are, do you want to venture off?
There's some people that don't know who I am already?
Yeah.
My fame hasn't preceded me? My name is Nathan Williams. I'm the founder and CEO of MindSpider. Mm-hmm. And so we are using blockchain to track responsibly sourced metals. So essentially it's a protocol for transferring supply chain data, essentially, about metals that have been responsibly sourced. So some people may have heard of the issue of conflict minerals. This is how we got started thinking about how can we avoid funding terror, funding armed groups in Congo and in areas like that with the metals that go into our smartphones and our jewelry. And it's a challenge because although companies really want to protect themselves from thank you, someone just delivered me coffee. Although companies want to protect their brand image, no one wants to end up funding slavery, human rights abuses, environmental disasters. It is an enormous challenge because metals are fungible. They can be mixed together. It's not like a diamond where you can maybe engrave the edge. It's a bit more complicated than, say, clothing where you can put in a tag and make sure it came not from a sweatshop. Like, those are challenges, not to say that those aren't complicated, but this is sort of another level of complicated because you've got this issue of intermixability, like gold from multiple smelters can be smelted together
into one, and how can you then understand? But okay,
yeah, it's a big challenge, and so what we've done is we've come up with a protocol that is able to do sort of two things. On the one hand, it can transmit unique identifiers for shipment numbers, for weighed bags and containers, so that metal coming out of a responsible source can be sort of tracked. And on the other hand, it also allows for blockchain tracking of pure mass amounts. So think of like how you would track green energy on an electrical grid. If you go out and buy green energy tomorrow, the electricity going to your house will still be mixed with coal and nuclear, but the money that you've paid will be traceable back to the green energy company because it's limited by the amount of production. So you know that the wind farm is producing, say, 100 kilowatt hours, and so you're buying 100 kilowatt hours, and so...
so even if you take some non-green energy, your payment is still focused on the green energy supply.
Exactly. So it's important with metals to have the option to do both things, because if you're, for example, a smelter in the middle of the supply chain, you're refining metals come in from multiple sources. Theoretically, to participate in the world market, you should have gone to all your mines, done due diligence, make sure they're all responsible. But not everyone's going to be working on blockchain tomorrow. And so unless you have two different production lines, it's impossible to not have those amounts from the blockchain certified and the non-blockchain certified sources mixed together. Like it's really not scalable beyond a test or a pilot project. So having this ability to do mass balance at the same time as being able to track unique shipments or once it's in final form is critical to being sure that you have a responsible solution that can scale to industrial levels.
Interesting, because you already went ahead and talked about one of the points that I want to ask you about is I read an interview that you did some time ago. I don't know how long it was, but you talked about the analogy between the green energy and your company, and I was interested in going a little bit more in depth, and you already did that in the intro.
Well, it's funny that in a industrial blockchain setting, you really do need a lot of analogies in order to help communicate this. And
I think even in the blockchain area, you need a lot of analogies, seeing that it's still very early stage.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about anything blockchain related, it's almost career level complex, right? Like there's a lot of people sniffing around that are interested because there's, new technology, money to be made. There's people who don't want to miss the boat, but understanding it is a challenge. And it's sort of like, I mean, how does the internet work? What is the internet?
Yeah.
Average person can't explain that, but they know what it is because they use it. And that's where we're going to get with blockchain, but we're not there yet. And so having analogies is important.
So you think that for the blockchain technology as a protocol, as an idea, it's still very in its early stages, as everyone knows, but you think that in some time people will stop thinking as analogies and start thinking as just internet as it is?
I think so, because it'll become part of what we use. I mean, this is sort of what everyone expects, is that it's going to achieve mass adoption, that it's going to maybe underpin a lot of the technologies we take for granted every day. And I mean, right now, sort of like the internet. I mean, do you know how the internet works?
I have no idea.
TCP/IP. Most people can't explain it. It's very technical, but
even HTTP and HTTPS, it's protocols that it's hard to explain. If someone asks you, say, "Well, this is the interface of the web. This is secure interface of the web," but even so, it's what?
Exactly. And when you're dealing with something like regulatory tech. Regulations and policy are also career level complex. It's just a completely different field, right? And so people, they spend their careers learning the ins and outs of international policy, and there are unintended consequences when you change the game theory of this stuff. And so when you've got blockchain, which is, one sort of ivory tower world, and you've got policy, which is another, mixing them together is a challenge. And so that's why I saw sort of the opportunity to sort of put a hand in both fields, stand in the gap and say, okay, well, someone's got to know about how this works. And that was sort of what appealed to me about this field in the first place.
So taking a little step back on that, why regulatory technology? Because from what I've read about you, it's not the first startup that you work in regulatory
I think
tech.
that sort of answers the own question. I mean, I had the background. When I first moved to Berlin, or maybe I should back up.
Where are you from?
I'm from Canada originally, and I was 15 years in Montreal. I did my Bachelor of Computer Science and then my MBA, and then afterwards a lot of people I knew had moved away, and my wife and I said, it's time for a change. My wife had visited Berlin briefly, and she said, I like the city, because she visited in July before, not during the winter.
I mean, Canada in the winter might be harsher than Berlin, no?
Oh, yeah.
Depends on the place in Canada.
Anyway, I said it was good enough for me, and we came. And Canada, when we left, Canada was negative 25 degrees. It was negative 5 in Berlin, so I was like, all right, let's go to the beach. But it was gray for 6 weeks when we first arrived, and it took a lot of doing to make my network here. And my goal was to integrate myself into the startup scene. And my first company I started was because I had a contact who was following what I was doing on Facebook, and after I graduated, and saw that I made connections in Berlin and was getting things started, and it was a regulatory tech company, and it was called NW Hinwise Solutions, and I still have that company. It does a lot of things. We do software development, and the first thing that we did was software for a large, basically an oil, and it wasn't that large, a medium-sized oil and gas supply company, a service company, and one of the owners had stolen $12 million from the other owners, and they wanted to prove it. And they had all of the documentation handwritten on paper, and they wanted to basically put it into a giant database, compare it to the internal accounting records, which were also on paper and had taken multiple transactions and merge them into one without in multiple currencies without having the exchange rate present. And so we had to use statistical methods to sort of compare and say, okay, well, was this reasonable, or was someone trying to make money off of this? And in order for them to prepare their case. And
and that was Hinweis?
Hinweis.
Hinweis.
It's sort of like the German word Hinweis, like advice. So it's sort of like a English-German pun.
Okay, so Hinweis, was that the main company? Because from what I read, it's more of a company builder itself, right?
I spun off everything else from that company. So it's a company on its own. And I used the skills and expertise and the people in that company to found other projects. And I founded a number of other projects. Some of them became their own companies, some of them did not.
Like Subvise, for example.
Subvise was my project that took off after that, and it was a chemical regulation startup. And so basically, as my first big project was wrapping up with Hinweis, we saw that we would need other projects, and I was talking to other people in the regulatory space, and we saw there was a European chemical regulation that was going to be hitting people hard, called the REACH regulation. And essentially it meant that every chemical that is used in Europe had, over a certain tonnage amount, had to be registered with tests done depending on how much was used, scientific data gathered. It was a huge problem for companies. And we basically created this monitoring system to keep track of changes in the regulation automatically for people. We had BASF as a customer for a while.
Who, sorry?
BASF. And it was basically to keep track of a large list of chemicals. And in the end, we ended up merging with a company, a competitor company, and we felt we would do better together. Toward the end, we were working on machine learning algorithms for identifying legislative documents that were about chemicals and not, so that we could early detect changes. And yeah, that's how I got started in regulatory tech. And then
it's a very unsexy area of tech, I assume, no?
It's funny, the unsexiness makes it sexy. Like, I never had problems speaking at places, because in the tech world, everyone's doing an app for the next e-commerce, the next social media, whatever, and they're like, ooh, you're doing something for industry. This is interesting, It's like, it's not quite blue ocean, but it's pretty blue ocean. I mean, there's like not many companies that know the field, and the ones that do usually are either old economy, so they're more traditional, slower moving. They may or may not be agile. They may or may not be relying as heavily on PR and the coolness factor like a traditional startup, or on angel funding or VC funding in order to scale fast. They might not even be thinking of scale or disruption. So it's an interesting space to be in as a startup.
Interesting.
Same thing with my most recent one, which is MindSpider, right? So we've had a lot of support and help from people, because there are accelerators and there are programs specifically dedicated to startups in the mining sector. I think there are 3 startups in the mining sector. Like, there are more people looking to help startups in the mining sector than there are mining startups, because it's got a barrier to entry. You have to know the industry, and there
aren't a lot of people in the industry outside of the startup world that is interested in creating a startup.
Well, think about it this way. I mean, if you're in the mining industry, you see the problems, but you also have a job that probably pays you 80 to 100,000 euros a year. And so are you going, and maybe you have a wife and kids and you've got a lot of experience, and are you really ready to put all of that on the line at an outside chance while your kids are still in school? So it's sort of hard to make that leap when you've got sort of this stability. But if you're in a position to actually start a mining startup, like maybe you're doing your PhD and you've come across something interesting, or you're that's really the only place that you can, because I mean, if you're like a 20-something going out to start a startup, you're going to be thinking of the problems that you encounter day to day. You're going to be thinking e-commerce. You're going to be thinking, I have trouble communicating. You're going to be thinking, I want to do something for IDs or something that you've experienced.
On the day-to-day.
How many people who are in a position to start a startup have experience in the mining industry?
Then let me put it this way. How did you get into the mining area? Because I assume you weren't...
Through Subvise. So and through the end users. So the thing is, with Subvise, I was in contact with a lot of large companies who, and the people I was talking with were in product stewardship. And product stewardship means that they're dealing with chemical hazards, but it also means they're dealing with other parts of the raw materials, including conflict minerals. And so this was sort of my introduction to that world. And I was looking for applications of blockchain after I was introduced by a few people. And I said, okay, well, how can we apply this? And conflict minerals looked like a direct application that had a lot of interest at the time.
So taking now the main focus of this interview more on the MindSpider area. So you were introduced on blockchain by some people, and you sought to find out some application on the real world of the technology.
Always, yeah. You always want to find, I always want to find an application to the real world. And I consider myself sort of half entrepreneur, half inventor. I love tinkering with things and seeing, okay, what can we build out of this?
But that's good. Half entrepreneur, half maker. I mean, since the Pioneers show, it's innovators, creators, builders, makers, entrepreneurs. It's good because you're trying to get in all of the words that we try to put in.
I like building. I don't have enough time to build, honestly. Like I still tinker. I still code. Not as much as I would like to, and if I was responsible for building MindSpider myself, it would probably get done sometime in 2021. But
because of the lack of time you have for other projects as well.
I mean, there's only so many things that you can focus on at a given time, and when you're CEO, your job is to get money in, right? I mean, you got to build the team. You got to build the communications. You got to make sure that the legal is right. You've got to, but ultimately you get money in, and then other people do the work. That's sort of the role it is. And I think first-time entrepreneurs may or may not realize that honestly, the trouble that I've run into over and over again is focusing on too many areas. It's like I like building, and so I want to focus on a good product. And the problem with focusing on a good product is that someone's got to go and sell the darn thing. So, someone's got to make sure that investment money is coming in, and that's a form of sales. Someone's got to make sure that HR, like you're recruiting top talent. That's selling as well. You're telling people you should take a risk on us. Yeah. Like there's a lot going on there, and it's not that builder founders aren't good. I mean, I've met some builder founders who are amazing, that they built the first prototype themselves, and I still, like I said, I still code, but I know enough to get me in trouble. Probably not enough that I could build the MVP.
Okay.
I could probably build the prototype, but not the MVP, because it would just take way too long.
Okay, and as a CEO, let's put it this way: what's this is some area that, even though I'm working in blockchain area, it still sometimes gets me a little bit confused. What's the economy around the MindSpider area? So how does the money come in? I assume it's through ICOs, token sales.
So this is a good thing to talk about sort of in general, that in general, for a blockchain project, you have a number of different business models, right? And you need to have a proper token economy if you're doing something decentralized. MindSpider is going to be decentralized. It is going to be a protocol. And on top of the protocol, we are building our own app, our DApp.
DApp.
Right, or DApp. I prefer DApp as well. I've heard people pronounce it both. But basically, it's sort of like you build your own app that functions with the internet.
It's on top of Ethereum, I assume.
Right now, we're building on Ethereum.
Okay.
Exactly. So the thing is, the protocol can be funded with a token. right? And you need to use a token in order to do key functions of a distributed system. You need to stake tokens in order to interact with the system, like to be registered, to be certified, to have governance and vote in the system. And this is important for a decentralized system, because otherwise you have one central body saying, okay, well, I'll charge a fee and I'll control who gets to access the system and who doesn't. And what we see with MineSpider and with the mining industry in general is that it is very important to have one standard. Let me back up just ever so slightly.
Sure.
Right now, a number of companies are experimenting with blockchain solutions for the mineral supply chain, right? So you've got BMW, you've got IBM, you've got a couple of different companies that are building up pilots for sourcing certain minerals. The problem is that if you've got 50 different end companies that all have their own private permission blockchains, somewhere in the upstream is going to be a smelter that has 50 different systems to use. They all don't talk to each other. They all communicate off-chain. Like decisions as to which minerals go to who are made off-chain, and it becomes an logistical and organizational nightmare. And if that happens, all of the organizational work is on that upstream supplier, so that smelter or the mine or whoever it is, and
has to connect everything to different systems, different blockchains, different UI, whatever.
And what's the incentive for them to run it? You know, like they want to be part of BMW's supply chain, maybe, or all of these others. But I mean, it ends up eroding the effectiveness of the system. And so, from our point of view, what's needed is a disincentive to have competition. There should be one smart contract system or one set of tools that everybody uses, but then they should feel comfortable that their supply chain data is self-sovereign. No one's going to see it except
them. When you say one, is that for both the main guys, so IBM, BMW, that uses MineSpider at the same time that the miners use it as well? So one system to rule them all.
Exactly. Like, I mean, it's sort of like if you wanted to create the next Uber competitor and you said, okay, well, we better build our own internet. It wouldn't work, you know, because people would have to have their own protocol on their phone, and if every app you build an Airbnb competitor, okay, well, I guess I'm going to build my own internet now. You know, it's like eventually these systems don't talk to each other. You end up having communications issues. You know, you would have issues with processing payments. You'd have issues with all sorts of things if you don't have one standard protocol to use. And so the idea here is, if you have a protocol, number one, it should not have an intrinsic fee, because if it has an intrinsic fee, then you've incentivized someone to go and create a competitor that doesn't have the fee, so that they can have control. And then the second thing is that it should not have a centralized entity controlling it.
Okay.
All right. So if Nathan at MineSpider is saying, okay, this company can join and this company doesn't, then I'm susceptible to bribery. Right? It's like, okay, well, you know,
you're corruptible.
I'm corruptible at that point. And, you know, no, of course I'm not. No, you know, I would never be corruptible, but, you know, like if I left and someone else took over, then, you know, no, but this is the thing. You don't want one single point of failure. You want to set up a system that works at scale, where if a group of companies comes in and they say, well, this is done fairly, we can join the system as sort of the trusted providers of whatever material, right? So how do you do that? Well, the idea then is you have, I'm drawing a line out here, but you have the MineSpider protocol, which is one standardized way of transmitting information that has the following properties. It creates an immutable, verifiable link between suppliers and end users. End users can see that there's a link, but they don't necessarily know who the links are in between.
Sorry, just before end users, we're assuming the big companies, the big
companies. Sorry.
Okay, so it ends.
Downstream users, I'm going to say, not in consumers.
Okay, so it ends. The last user ends on the company that sells it.
Exactly.
Okay.
We could theoretically take this model to an end consumer, but I think that would be a mistake at this point.
Okay.
We're looking right now at regulatory compliance, due diligence, like things within industry.
Sorry, so we have on one side of the line you have the miners and the smelters and everything, and on the other side you have the end users. So yeah.
So essentially, you need a protocol where if I'm, say, participating, I'm buying metal from a supplier, I would see my data from my immediate supplier. Of course, I know who they are, but I don't. I know that they've purchased in an unbroken link back to a responsible mine, and I see which mines those are. But I don't necessarily see the links in between because that's sensitive information. I just see that those links exist, that it's there's an anonymous link and a certain amount of tonnage was sold through there, so I can have confidence that the amount that I have is backed up by due diligence information that proves that this shipment was responsible. And the thing is, I want to make sure as well that my competitors cannot see this information. All right, that I can prove that my material is responsible to the people that ask, to the regulators, to the amnesty groups, to to myself, but that I wouldn't be able to have my competitor come in and cut off my supply chain by buying out all of our mid-tier suppliers because they know where we get our stuff from, or things like that. You know, that's sensitive company information. That's important to guard. And then finally, it needs to be scalable to industry. So how do you accomplish all of that, basically? And the answer is it's quite complex. It's taken about a year of design in order to come up with a protocol that will do that. A high-level model is that we've used what I like to call a Russian doll sort of data structure, where
the matryoshkas.
Yeah, matryoshka. How do you pronounce that?
I say matryoshkas because
matryoshka. So essentially, if you imagine that a mine would be certified, you know how much they produce because they're a big responsible mine, they've been audited. Then they create a data packet. And this data packet will have due diligence information. Maybe it's photos of the mine, maybe it's a list of their miners, maybe it's a scan of their certificate. They can then sell that. They can sell this data to the next people up the supply chain. And maybe because they are good for a certain amount of material and they sell some material to 3 different customers who will then be able to decrypt the data packet themselves, add their own data, re-encrypt it with the
interesting. So each block itself is more on the certifications of the different players within the supply chain.
Exactly. It actually gets a bit more complicated than that with how we deal with private data that you don't want to be seen upstream and public data that you do, but that's more or less the mentality that we're coming with, is this matryoshka data packet, so that when you buy it, you would see sort of
more information, but not necessarily.
More information, but not necessarily your competitor's information. And
interesting.
Then hashes of that are stored in the blockchain along with the registered amounts, and so that you can actually connect the data storage with the blockchain records, and that there's immutability as well.
The thing is that there's. It's kind of expensive to assume this kind of control on. I assume that mining companies are not all big corporations.
No, absolutely not.
So it's small family businesses, I assume. So
they're called ASMs, artisanal and small scale miners, and that's where a lot of the challenge comes in.
So how do you incentivize that a small team of non-miners? So the guys that run the business, the managers, are incentivized to participate and maintain the control of their own.
I want you to imagine. If you're a small miner, maybe in Congo or maybe somewhere else, You probably hear from your friends, oh, there's a mineral deposit over here. Let's go and just get it. Then and you're mining, and then suddenly an armed group comes in and says, hey, we'll give you a 20% money laundering bonus if you sell to us. Now, beforehand, you were going to a depot and selling there, and it's legal, and you collect information because someone comes in and says, hey. You got to pay taxes on this. You got to do this legally, fill out these forms. But now someone's offering you a 20% money laundering bonus to sell illegally and to collect taxes off you. It's a non-state armed group, and so your incentives are misaligned. This is a problem, and so I want you to imagine now we have sort of a system where you could get paid for sourcing legally. So you collect this data, but then you sell this data as an asset, as its own asset. And now you have an income stream. And maybe the group that sets up this way of giving you this income stream also provides education and how to onboard. Like, this is not a small problem, right? But
I assume it's not. I mean,
if it was a small problem, it would have been solved a long time ago. But because people have been working on this for years. But I think what I'm getting at is that there have been unintended consequences of the conflict mineral regulations that have come into play. So there have been negative incentives for for ASMs especially, but for miners in general to participate because all the costs are on them. And by having this sort of blockchain structure, you can end up connecting the people that benefit from the data to the responsible sources, and then the people that want to sell responsibly can end up getting an income stream from providing this due diligence data.
So through tokens, I assume.
Sure. Exactly. You can convert tokens into
fiat or.
Yeah. These are steps in the plan, but the idea is that if you can set up this sort of system to positively incentivize mines to participate, then you can expand to make sure that the ASMs aren't left behind.
So basically, you're incentivizing through the token, through different income streams at the same time that you're providing education and probably other kinds of infrastructures that provide. So my assumption is...
The idea isn't that I provide everything. The idea is that we're providing sort of the protocol, the plan, the platform, and then we have a number of partners that would come in. Like, the idea here is we've created a protocol. We're going to create a DApp, DApp that can run pilots, and we can develop into its own business, but other people can make their own dApps. Maybe SAP wants its own integration with SAP. There's nothing stopping them from integrating and using our protocol, because if someone down the line is buying a data packet from MindSpider and a data packet from SAP that's integrated also in the MindSpider protocol, then it'd be able to decode them both easily and add their own thing and sell them on. So there's
each of those big companies that's creating their own private blockchains, or as you said, I don't remember the exact sentence, but BMW and IBM that are creating their own blockchains, they can integrate directly with MindSpider.
That is the plan. So the idea here is to take it away from private permission blockchains and make it into a public one, because I believe that public blockchain is necessary for transparency. As soon as you have private permission, you run into problems, because then if you're supplying multiple private permission blockchains, then decisions are made off chain about the provenance and which minerals go where, and that leads to eroding of the trust of the system. But if you're dealing with transparency, it should be public. That's the thing. And so then, how do you make sure that public data on a public chain is still secure, so that you don't lose your business intelligence or anything like that? And that's where this data structure, the Matryoshka doll structure comes in. That's where the transmission protocol comes in, where should really people should feel comfortable building on top of it because it's open source, because people can see how it runs, and then people can still set up their own businesses on it. We're not going out to replace all of the auditors or the due diligence companies. No, they should be comfortable
using the MindSpider structure and platform.
Exactly.
That's interesting. So basically, you're, in some sense, centering a lot of information, but on a public network. So you're decentralizing centralization at the same time. That's
accurate. I mean, a lot of people talk about decentralization and centralization, or trust and trustless, as though they're absolutes, but what it is changing what parts are trusted and what parts are trustless. It's changing what parts are centralized and what parts are decentralized. So for example, you've got a lot of people in the supply chain that don't necessarily trust each other, but that doesn't mean it's a completely trustless system. You still have to have a way of gathering information or a way of self-reporting that, or you need trusted third parties to audit, or like there's a lot of places where there are existing methodologies for ensuring trust in this system. But what we're providing is a way of transmitting that trust up the chain in a way where you don't necessarily have to hold hands with your competitors and say, well, we totally trust you, competitor, to not use this information for evil instead of for good. And so, I don't have to trust, for example, a centralized database company like with all of my private data. I mean, think about this. We could do everything that I'm describing with a centralized database.
Yeah, sure.
Easily. Except then you would have a single point of failure. Then I would have control of everybody's supply chain data. I could control who is good and who is bad. And so we could decentralize that a bit by having it maybe run by an association of companies. But then you still have this issue of, does this association control the entire global market? Not everyone will want that. So how can you decentralize it in a way where people from multiple countries, multiple points of the industry feel they have a voice and they're not being controlled by some sort of third-party police force that they don't have a voice in, versus how can you make sure that it's not anarchy?
Segueing into a different area, but at the same time in the same tokenization area. Have you performed any token sale, any ICO, any?
Not yet. We intend to. We have set up a Swiss structure because we've got a Swiss guy on the team. Right now, we've been funded by selling equity, like a standard startup. But our intention is to go and do a token sale. We're still looking into the way it has to be structured so that it's a token that the people that can use use properly. It has to be legal. It has to
to be compliant and with all regulations.
Make sure that it. But I mean, I think that for a system to be decentralized in a way like this, where we're creating a protocol instead of a centralized company that's just going to run it. It has to use a token. There's no way around it.
And I assume that on the long-term vision, that you already said this or tinkled a little bit around it, but I assume that you'll be able to eventually not only talk about minerals, but talk about other, I won't say properties, other
raw materials.
Raw materials.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no particular reason why you can't do this for any other fungible good, like coffee or palm oil or
charcoal.
It's funny you mentioned charcoal. I remember a few months ago talking with a fellow who did a documentary on charcoal. Apparently a good chunk of the charcoal sold in Germany comes from Namibia, I believe. And he was saying that Boko Haram gets funded by that because...
Whoa.
Yeah, and it's not something that you would be aware of. Now, I haven't followed up with this fellow who was making the documentary at the time, but I mean, these are big challenges, and even though there's no specific, conflict charcoal law, right, like there is with conflict minerals, it's still an important point that... And still
that there's still a somewhat responsible way of doing stuff, and eventually, in some day or another, maybe there will be some regulation on the charcoal area.
if the technology exists, I could imagine it coming into play, and maybe it should. Like I don't think there's anyone alive that wants to, fund armed groups and human rights abuses and environmental abuses. I think it's just that they don't have the tools to be able to make responsible choices. And if it becomes easy, if it becomes painless, then there's no reason why we shouldn't, right? I mean, for me, I don't see this as a zero-sum game. And I also don't see MindSpider as being sort of an activist NGO sort of thing. I see us as helping companies, helping them to provide goods and services in a responsible way that makes it easy for them, so that the customers can feel comfortable. I'm buying this and it's fine. No one wants to fund these atrocities. And moreover, people don't want to have the responsibility of looking. People want to trust that a company has this well under control. You don't want to pay $100 premium for a responsible iPhone. You're paying a premium already for the brand, and you want to be able to trust that it is done correctly. And that's why these big brands have spent so much time and effort and resources on trying to secure the supply chain. And the ones that have the biggest brand are the ones that have put the most time and money into it, because they want to be responsible. It's an enormous challenge. Before blockchain, it was really impossible. And right now we're on the edge of seeing how, with the proper protocol, with the proper technology and the proper onboarding, we can actually get there. We're still at sort of the early days. But it's moved from the realm of, oh my goodness, this is impossible, to this is going to be possible.
Probably not today, but eventually.
It's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. I mean, people are still working on core blockchain technologies now. They're working on throughput, on 7 transactions a second. How can you increase that? And we're seeing sort of next generation blockchain projects that are built on top of existing projects, like IDs and versioning and document history. And what we're talking about with MindSpider is almost built on top of that, right? So it's supply chain is complex because it's a large number of transactions a second. It's a lot of people who are involved in the process, and I think it's going to come in stages. It doesn't mean that it's a long way off before we're going to see it having an impact in the industry, or being piloted, or actually making a difference. But we're still a little ways off from seeing widespread adoption where it's sort of normal, right? Because there's a lot of challenges to overcome, and we're really at the beginning of seeing companies say, "Oh, how do we do this?"
Segueing into a little bit more about learning about this specific subject, not necessarily just the regulatory part, but blockchain itself. Imagine that you weren't here, you're at a big office with a lot of people, assuming that you wanted to leave and create something on the blockchain area. Let's assume that you were before you were introduced to blockchain. Where did you start to learn? What did you see? What did you read?
Well, I have some stories for you. So at the beginning, January 2017, I decided I was going to do this. And so my first thing was I had to learn about 2 very complex areas: blockchain and conflict minerals. And so coincidentally, around that same time, there was a Washington Post article that was printed on conflict minerals, and I phoned everybody mentioned in the article. I emailed them and I said, "Hey, I'm doing this blockchain for conflict minerals project. Can we talk about it?" And I met a number of people in the industry. I got invites to go to events. I talked with people from Intel, from Apple, from Dell, from people that have been engaged with this subject for 10 years or more. And I ended up going to the OECD. I ended up talking to people from the European Commission, because it was a hot topic, but it was sort of at the crest of a wave. And I started posting about all of the people I was talking with and about the ideas, and people saw I was now into blockchain, and so I got recommended to be a speaker at certain events. And keep in mind, this is like 2 months into figuring out that blockchain exists. And sometimes you got to fake it till you make it. And I was invited to be on a panel at a developers conference for blockchain. And the conference was in German. And my German is sort of rudimentary. And so what I did is I said, of course I will do it. And I read the Wikipedia article on blockchain, and I sat at the end of the panel so that the host would ask everybody else first, and I would listen for keywords about blockchain adoption, and I would go off on my pre-prepared thing in German about how about blockchain, and I would go, does that make sense? And everyone would sort of nod and yes, oh, that's good, and so
that's smart.
I faked my way through it, but it was, and then afterwards I started my own podcast.
I wanted to segue into that. It's called Analysis in Chains, correct?
Analysis in Chains. Like I had been posting about blockchain, and by time July rolled around, I had learned a fair bit. I had done some initial designs for MindSpider. I had tested the ideas with key people in the industry about how it might work and how it would be different than what they had already tried. And then a friend of mine that I went to school with contacted me and was like, "Yeah, crypto's amazing. It's going off the charts." It was summer 2017 when Bitcoin was just starting to break through, right? And and I actually hadn't been following the crypto scene. I had no idea that it was going off the charts with all.
So you were following the technology itself and not the
exactly,
and not the economy.
Up until that point, I hadn't followed the economy, and so we had talked together and said, okay, well, why don't we just start researching this and start our own podcast? And so that was our outlet for doing research on what is blockchain. And so my friend did research on the economy, and I did research on the technology, and we put it together, and it worked really well because at the time, most of the existing podcasts were either very technology focused or they were focused on pumping coins, pumping ICOs, and so we attracted the attention of a number of people, including a big PR firm, who was interested in our podcast, which at the time had 50 listeners. Simply because there was no one else out there that was taking an analytical approach. And obviously some more entered the field around the same time or shortly afterwards, but because of that, we were able to interview some very high-profile people from some really good startups, and that was another benefit to us, is that I started to meet all of the big names
in the blockchain community.
In the blockchain
so
community.
you basically created also on top of the existing credibility just you were starting to get, you got thought leadership just because of not just because, but because of the podcast itself.
That was part of the strategy. It was, if you're going to be the person that sort of ties two worlds together, it's important to be seen as a blockchain person. And we've had a couple of people from big companies that have found us found MindSpider through the podcast, and said, "Oh, this is interesting. You're a blockchain person that has the solution to my problem." So.
For someone out there that has no connection with blockchain, I deeply advise you to listen. I think it's episode 26. It's called Bitcoin and Blockchain. It's a very interesting, where you go very in depth on the technology, but at the same time in a very usual English. And I think it's very interesting.
I believe it's, I wanted to say 46. It was at the beginning of January.
I think so. I think your partner was not with you.
Analysisandchains.com. And it was beginning of January where I go into an explanation of what Bitcoin is, how it works.
Probably it's 46, yeah.
Like how the hashing algorithm works, like why it's secure, what is proof of work, all of these things that are sort of core to understanding blockchain. And I've actually had to do a number of presentations on this for big companies. I've talked already to a couple of large banks.
Interesting.
Like teaching them basically, this is how blockchain works, and this is why it's important for you. This is why it's disruptive, but this is how it actually works. And because the companies, they don't know, and they shouldn't have to. Be expected to know about this. Is very, very technical, but they should learn, because it is going to affect.
They should learn at least the analogies, maybe.
At least, I think that the nuggets of how it works, like what is proof of work, are not beyond the average person.
Okay.
There are very easy ways to understand why it works, but I think it's important.
So, when we were introduced, you talked with me saying that the podcast has just been acquired by Crypto News, correctly?
Exactly. So what we've decided to do is become part of a larger brand, because essentially I can't necessarily do everything at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So we had been working closely with the founder of CryptoNews.com, and he had given us a number of people to interview who were very high quality, and he came to me and said, "Hey, could you make me a podcast for Crypto News?" And I was like, "Well, why don't we just join forces?" Because this way.
So it was more of a merger.
I don't know what things are like, how you would define it, but essentially we're part of Crypto News now. And Crypto News is they're a multi-channel brand. They're a bigger brand than Analysis in Chains. Analysis in Chains started with a podcast. We grew to a certain number of listeners. It was great, and then we started live meetups in order to more engage with people on the ground. We have 3 cities covered: Berlin, London, and San Francisco. I'm actually going to be. Anyway, we've been doing once a month meetups.
But this is good for someone who's in the audience that is either in Berlin, London, or San Francisco. Should
advertise it on meetup.com. It's called Blockchain Unpacked, and we try to do interviews with people in the blockchain community. And
you then repurpose that information for the podcast itself?
Yeah. I post the live recordings on the podcast later, and anyway, but I was at the point of deciding, do I continue to try and grow my own media brand while getting MindSpider off the ground, which doesn't really make sense, or do I join forces with a bigger brand that can use this as part of their overall channel, and then I can focus on what I'm good at, which is hosting, and it would take less time, so I can now spend the majority of my time doing MindSpider stuff.
Interesting. Okay, now we'll go to more on some more specific questions, not necessarily only on blockchain and on the podcast itself. First of all, we have a question from the audience. Thank you, Sam, the one that introduced us. He asked, how did you get into responsible material sourcing?
So I mean, it was, I think I talked about this at the beginning. It was a combination of just being in the space, right? So being with my previous company in product stewardship circles, talking with people who were dealing with both the problem of hazardous materials and the problem of conflict minerals, and making sure that they were sourcing responsibly, and saying, okay, well, what are the problems that they're having? I think a lot of people get into blockchain thinking, okay, we've got a blockchain. How can we put a blockchain on something? Blockchain for whatever. Pick a word. Blockchain for X, and
blockchain for Uber.
Yeah, and the thing is, if you do that, you come up with a great solution for a problem no one has, and this is what I'm seeing with people piloting blockchain for conflict minerals on private permission blockchains, is that they're coming up with a solution maybe for the downstream users that don't incentivize the upstream to actually participate. And although it's cool, maybe the incentive right now is to be part of the latest blockchain craze, and you can sort of capitalize on the marketing. But in the long term, what people need is a solution for responsible sourcing. They don't need a blockchain for responsible sourcing. If blockchain is the thing that delivers that to them, then great. And so, the incentives have to be aligned. It has to be solving the right problem. And so I think that with the right problem, like spending the better part of a year talking with people about the specific problem that they had in the industry is really what led us to the solution that we have today.
Second question. You seem to be dip your toe in different areas. So from Hinwise to Analysis in Chains to MindSpider. You said that Subvise was merged with a competitor. How do you manage your time? Because that seems like a very exhausting life.
Yeah. It is.
But do you use any kind of framework or something like what's his name? The guy from Twitter, Jack Dorsey, that like every Monday, Wednesday, and it's finance or whatever, or do you like ad hoc and work on depending?
Yeah. I use the whatever is most urgent in front of my nose methodology, which is probably not the most efficient. However, like there's essentially a list of priorities that I have in front of me, and the top priority is MindSpider right now, and then I have the things that play into that. So it's basically I'm right now dealing with the most urgent things. I think in the long run, it's going to probably shift a bit. I mean, like, this is something I've dealt with as a problem for a long time, which is how to deal with this organizational mess of having multiple projects on the table. And as an entrepreneur, it's very easy to get into that because you find a lot of things interesting, and so maybe you start something, and maybe you need something on the side to keep it going until you're funded or whatever. I think for me right now, MindSpider is number one. Analysis in chains is important because part of it is benefiting MindSpider. So that's one of the reasons, and that it is still a priority. Subvise, I've largely handed that over. Hinwise, I've got a couple of projects with that, but they don't take up a lot of time. And so really the majority of my effort is only ever in one project at a time.
Great. Let's go for the fire round now. So you know, you're a podcaster, you know this idea is I'll ask you something and you have 1 minute to go into it.
Okay.
What's the 1 to 3 books that have influenced you the most?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think number 1 is going to be How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. It is a classic. Some of the stuff is outdated, but that has changed, fundamentally changed how I've approached business, how I've approached people, how I viewed the world. I think it really helped me go from a sort of fiery, hard to get along with a young pup to a fairly more a slightly less fiery, a slightly easier to get along with man. So so How to Win Friends and Influence People, that has been really good. I almost want to say Getting to Yes, except I haven't actually read it. I've read the Coles notes. That doesn't count. I don't know. There's been a lot of stuff that's influenced me through my education, through the MBA. But honestly, there's really only one that comes to mind as this is a book that has changed things. You know.
Okay.
Been a lot of people that have influenced me, but.
What's your favorite tool / the tool you wouldn't be able to live without? Be it an app, hardware, whatever. Sam, for example, said Erlang.
Good question. I do an awful lot with Slack. Slack, I mean, I should be doing more with Telegram, but I haven't quite mastered it yet. I have to think of sort of my working thing. I mean, I'm an old man, right? So I'm approaching 40. I use email heavily still. Everyone hates email, but that's really,
I love email.
That's really, a lot of people hate email.
I love email because I started using an email app called Newton, from the formerly deceased Cloud Magic, and I love just using that because it's really easy. Like, I know when someone reads my email, I snooze the emails, I send out to later, and it's like something that I go really easily.
No, I mean,
and then I have my own inbox zero kind of thing, so I know how to approach my own email.
Yeah, I mean, I use a lot of online tools. I have no idea which ones I couldn't live without, but I think the thing I use more than anything else is just email. But right now it's email, WhatsApp, and Slack.
Tell me something you've changed your mind in the last 6 months.
In the last 6 months, well, I was looking at more of a centralized model, to be honest. When I started MindSpider, I thought that the best way of approaching it would be completely different than what I'm approaching now. I wasn't looking at building an infrastructure. I was looking at building a blockchain company that would, we do an ICO, and then we would, charge a fee off of every transaction on our network. And then I realized that that's not going to change an industry. That's going to build a company. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with building a company, but I would then basically set myself up for creating 100 competitors, and then the competitors would lead to this problem of multiple private permission blockchains, which would hamper mass adoption in the industry. And I think that that's sort of counterproductive to what I wanted to see, which is an industry change.
Interesting. One of the last questions. So if you started today from scratch, where would you focus?
If I was starting today from scratch with the knowledge I have now?
Yes.
Team building. I probably would have, team building and fundraising. So if I started completely over, it's just me, I've got the knowledge that I have now, I would, number one, create a much more simplified white paper. I went very much into detail into how this is going to roll out over the next 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. And I probably would have done something much simpler. I would have focused on getting a solid team behind me, and then getting as simple a pilot out as possible, and then I would have PR'd the living heck out of that successful pilot. And that's still what we're going to do. It's just I would have done it about a year sooner, because then I would have gone, because essentially what's changed since a year ago is I understand the problem, right? And I understand how to approach it.
So if you started today, you would take out?
I would have taken out the entire thing that I couldn't take out. Like I couldn't have known this a year ago without really going deep into the problem, the industry, and what they're facing. So that's what I would do.
If someone wants to get in touch with you, other than analysisinchains.com, I strongly recommend everyone to listen to it. It's very fascinating, and I actually spend some time listening to some of your episodes.
Thank you.
Very well thought out. And as I said, that specific episode touched me because it's a very simple explanation of a very complex technology. So if someone wants to get in touch with you, how can they find you online?
Well, I guess they could contact me on LinkedIn. I connect with pretty much everyone on LinkedIn, and I consider that a really good way of keeping in touch with a large network of blockchain people. Mm-hmm. And aside from that, they can find my email address rather easily on mindspider.com. And if I get overwhelmed, then I'll just change email addresses and stop talking to people.
Okay, your LinkedIn and will be on the show notes. So as a parting piece of guidance, and once again,
they can also contact me on Twitter. I believe my handle is nwilliamsmba.
Yeah, I think so. And Williams MBA. So as a parting piece of guidance, one advice that you have for our Pioneer tribe.
Don't neglect your personal brand. A lot of how you get known in the industry, and a lot of how people trust you when you are small, when you are starting out, when nobody knows you, is your personal brand. How do people trust you? What do they perceive you as? And they should perceive you as knowledgeable about the tech, the person to go to for the industry that you're in. And the only way to do that is with creating content, talking with people, going on shows, doing PR, talking as much as possible, and also building up other people. It's like not everyone is going to, not everyone is going to be able to promote you unless you're able to provide them value as well. And so it's sort of a give and take relationship. And don't be afraid to sort of give value until you're perceived as and seen legitimately as the provider of value and the go-to person in your industry.
Thank you very much for your time, Nathan. It was a great time. It was a great interview. I really appreciate you taking the time and the fantastic content that you gave us and that you were provided me to be able to show to the rest of the world. Have a great one.
You too.
Thank you so much for plugging into this conversation. I must say that Nathan is a very entertaining guest, as you might have figured out, and would love to thank him for his time. I can't stress enough, go and subscribe to his podcast. It's called Analysis in Chains. And if you still don't understand a lot about blockchain, follow the link that I dropped on the show notes so that you can hear a great description of what it is and how it works. It's a great honor to have you listen to this in the podcast, and hope that if you have any questions or anything I can help with, feel free to reach out on social media. Once again, at It's DeAndre or at Pioneers Show, or on the website pioneershow.com. Any information that you might have missed will probably linked up in the show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider subscribing to make sure that this podcast grows and help everybody be the entrepreneurs of their lives and careers. Once again, it was really a great pleasure having you over there. Have a great time. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.